Here is section 1 of your epic, emotional, and cinematic revenge script based on your title. Given the massive length requirement, 10,000 to 15,000 words for a 50 to 60-minute narration, I will deliver the script section by section to ensure every single chapter is fully fleshed out with vivid, full-length voiceover narration. No summaries or shortcuts. Section 1. The Weight of Silence. The room smelled like damp earth, stale rain, and the faint, vanishing scent of lavender soap. That was Eleanor's soap. She had bought a 6-pack of it at a farmer's market 3 weeks before the coughing started, before the skin under her eyes turned the color of a bruised plum, before the doctors at St. Jude's began using words like aggressive, unusual, and terminal. I sat on the edge of our mattress, the springs groaning beneath my weight. Outside the window, the low sky of western Pennsylvania was leaking a thin, gray drizzle that smeared against the glass like dirt. It had been 42 days since we buried her in the hillside cemetery behind the old Lutheran church. 42 days of walking through an empty house that felt less like a home and more like a museum built for a ghost. My name is Arthur Vance. For 34 years, I was a high school history teacher at Millers Creek High. I spent my life teaching 16-year-olds about the fall of empires, about betrayal in ancient Rome, about the terrible things men do to one another when they think no one is watching. But I didn't know anything about real tragedy. Not until Eleanor died. Eleanor was 59. She wasn't supposed to die. We were supposed to go to Maine next spring. We had 2 small canvas bags packed in the top closet, filled with wool sweaters and walking shoes we bought on sale at Sears 5 years ago. We were going to rent a small cabin near the lighthouse in Portland, sit on the porch with lukewarm tea, and watch the waves break against the dark rocks. Instead, I was sitting alone in a house that was far too big for one pair of old boots, listening to the grandfather clock in the hallway tick like a heart that was slowly running out of reasons to beat. My son, Julian, didn't call today. He hadn't called in 6 days. Julian was 32, a senior partner at an investment firm in downtown Philadelphia. He wore suits that cost more than my monthly pension check, drove a black German sedan with tinted windows, and spoke in a fast, clipped tone that made every conversation feel like an audit. When his mother was in the hospital, he visited twice. Both times, he stayed for 11 minutes, checked his gold wristwatch 6 times, and left a box of cold, store-bought lilies on her bedside table before hurrying out to answer a call about a real estate trust. "Dad," he had told me in the hospital corridor while Eleanor was sleeping under the heavy fog of morphine, "you have to be pragmatic. Mother's condition is clear. We need to start looking at the property deed for the house. The tax implications of a transfer after her death could be catastrophic for my firm's holding strategy." I had looked at my son, my only child, the boy I had taught to throw a baseball in the overgrown grass behind the garage, and I hadn't recognized him. He didn't smell like wood smoke or fresh air like his mother. He smelled like dry cleaning chemical, expensive leather, and cold ambition. "Her heart is still beating, Julian," I had whispered to him, my voice shaking. "And it won't be by next week," he replied, not even looking at me as his fingers flicked across his phone screen. "I'm just trying to protect what's left, Dad. Someone has to be the adult here." He was right about one thing. Her heart stopped 6 days later. But he was wrong about everything else. I stood up from the bed, my knees popping in the quiet room. I walked over to Eleanor's vanity table. It was a dark mahogany piece with an oval mirror that had turned slightly cloudy around the edges over the decades. Her hairbrush was still there, a few silver strands of hair trapped between the bristles. Her small glass bottle of lavender oil set beside a half-empty box of mints. And in the bottom drawer, hidden beneath 3 folded lace tablecloths that had belonged to her grandmother, was the box. It wasn't a fancy box. It was a heavy, rectangular piece of dark iron, about the size of a thick hardcover book. It had no keyhole on the front, no brass latch, no decorative carvings. It was cold, rough, and unnaturally heavy, secured by a complex, double-dial brass cylinder lock built directly into the side. Eleanor had brought that box into our marriage 32 years ago. She had put it in the bottom drawer on our first night in this house, looked me in the eyes, and said 3 words. "Never ask, Arthur." And I hadn't. That was the kind of marriage we had. It wasn't built on secrets, but it was built on a deep, sacred respect for privacy. I knew she had grown up in a small coal mining town near the West Virginia border. I knew her father had died when she was 6, and her mother had worked 12-hour shifts at a textile mill until her hands gave out. I assumed the iron box held old family land deeds, perhaps a few silver coins her grandfather had saved during the Great Depression, or letters from a childhood friend who had passed away. For 34 years, I never touched it. I swept around it. I moved it when we painted the bedroom in 1998, but I never tried the dial. I respected her boundary because I loved her. But 3 days ago, while clearing out her closet to donate her coats to the church shelter, I found something else. Tucked into the lining of her old winter coat was a small leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked, the navy blue dye faded to a dull slate gray. It was held closed by a thin brass clasp that had rusted shut. When I broke the clasp with a pair of kitchen pliers, my hands were trembling. I felt like a thief in my own home, a man trespassing on holy ground. But as I flipped through the yellowed pages, my heart stopped. The journal wasn't a diary about recipes, garden flowers, or daily thoughts. The handwriting on the first 30 pages was Eleanor's, neat, slanted, precise cursive written in blue fountain pen ink. But starting on page 12, the handwriting changed. It became jagged, hurried, written with pressing force that had nearly torn through the paper. Names were written across the top of the pages. Dates from the late 1980s and early 1990s. Numbers that looked like bank routing codes, property serial identifiers, and corporate account ledgers. And then on page 4, there was a single paragraph written in red ink that made the room turn ice cold around me. If Arthur is reading this, it means I am gone, and the agreement has been broken. They did not let me die of natural causes. Check the iron box. The brass cylinder key is not a standard key. Go to Miller's Lock and Key on 4th Street. Ask for Thomas. Show him page 4. Do not tell Julian. Do not tell the police. Thomas knows what the numbers mean. I read those lines 4 times. The house seemed to shrink around me until the only sound was the heavy, labored rhythm of my own breathing. They did not let me die of natural causes. My mind raced back to her final months. The sudden, terrifying onset of her illness. The way her strength had vanished not over years, but over 4 short months. The way the doctors had seemed puzzled by the chemical imbalances in her blood work, calling it an unusual autoimmune degradation that didn't match any standard textbook case. And Julian's relentless, almost desperate insistence that we forego an autopsy to save money and preserve her dignity. My hands shook so violently that the journal slipped from my fingers, landing face down on the wooden floorboards. I looked at the iron box sitting on the bed. Who was Eleanor? What had she been hiding for 34 years under my own roof? And why had the woman who spent her life baking bread, tending to hydrangeas, and singing quietly in the church choir left me a warning that felt like a line from a nightmare? I picked up the journal, tucked it into the inside pocket of my heavy wool coat, and grabbed the iron box. It felt like an anvil in my hands, heavy with 3 decades of silence. I walked out of the house, locked the front door behind me, and stepped out into the freezing Pennsylvania rain. The rain picked up as I drove through the falling twilight of Miller's Creek. My old sedan's windshield wipers slapped rhythmically against the glass, clearing away the water only for another wave of cold gray mist to blur the road ahead. Miller's Creek was an old industrial town that had seen better decades. The steel mills along the river had closed back in the late 90s, leaving behind hollow brick structures, rusted water towers, and streets lined with forgotten storefronts. 4th Street was in the oldest part of downtown, a narrow strip of cracked pavement sandwiched between a closed-down pharmacy and an old coal supply warehouse. I parked along the curb, turned off the engine, and sat in the quiet dark for a moment. Beside me on the passenger seat, wrapped in an old bath towel, was the heavy iron box. The journal sat securely inside my coat pocket, resting against my chest like a cold block of ice. Through the rain-streaked window, I saw a small, flickering neon sign hanging behind a dirt-smeared glass window, Miller's Lock and Key, EST 1974. I pulled my collar up around my neck, grabbed the iron box, and stepped out into the freezing downpour. The bell above the shop door gave a dull, metallic chime as I pushed inside. The air hit me immediately, a sharp, pungent mix of machine oil, brass filings, damp wood, and old tobacco smoke. Hundreds of blank keys hung on board racks along the walls like tiny brass scales. Ancient key-cutting machines, covered in dark grease and metal dust, sat on worn wooden workbenches behind a counter topped with scratched glass. From the dark back room behind a heavy leather curtain, a slow, heavy footstep approached. "We're closing up for the night, partner," a raspy voice called out. The curtain was pulled aside, and an old man stepped into the yellow light of the single overhead bulb. He looked to be in his late 70s, with a broad, stooped frame, thick calloused hands stained black around the knuckles, and a deep scar running from his left eyebrow down to his jawline. He wore a heavy leatherwork apron over a plaid flannel shirt. He wiped his hands on an oiled rag and gave me a tired, indifferent glance. But then his eyes dropped to the towel-wrapped object under my arm. I'm looking for Thomas," I said, my voice sounding thin and uncertain in the quiet room. The old man stopped wiping his hands. His posture straightened slightly, his sharp gray eyes locking onto mine with a sudden, intense focus. "I'm Thomas," he replied, his tone lowering. "Who sent you?" "My wife," I said, my chest tightening. Eleanor Vance." For a long 3 seconds, the only sound in the shop was the rain hammering against the front window and the low hum of a refrigerator in the back. Thomas didn't move. He didn't blink. The tired, indifferent expression melted away, replaced by something dark, guarded and deeply troubled. "Eleanor," he repeated softly. He looked past me, scanning the empty street outside through the glass door before reaching up and flipping the deadbolt locked. He turned the open sign to closed and pulled down the dark canvas shade over the window. "Bring it to the back," Thomas said quietly, gesturing toward the leather curtain. I followed him into a small, cluttered office filled with filing cabinets, old blueprints, a small desk lamp, and a massive floor safe from the early 1900s. He cleared a pile of iron gears off a heavy oak table and pointed at the bare wood. "Put it down." I unwrapped the towel and set the iron box down. The heavy metal made a dull thud against the wood. Thomas didn't touch the box immediately. He stared at the brass cylinder lock on the side, his fingers tracing the air an inch above the metal without making contact. "She held on to it," he murmured to himself. 34 years. She actually kept it." He raised his head, looking at me with a mixture of pity and grave seriousness. "How is she, Arthur?" My breath hitched. "You know my name. I know who you are. I've known who you were since 1992. Thomas said softly. "Answer the question, Arthur. How is Eleanor?" "She passed away," I managed to say, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. 6 weeks ago. Cancer. Or at least, that's what the hospital told me. Thomas closed his eyes. He let out a long, heavy breath through his nose, his shoulders dropping 2 inches, as if a heavy weight had just settled onto his chest. He reached down to the desk, pulled out a brass key, unlocked a small wooden cabinet, and poured 2 fingers of amber whiskey into a smudged glass. He swallowed it in one sharp gulp. "She gave me a journal," I continued, pulling the navy blue book from my jacket pocket. "She left a note on page 4. It said to bring the box here. It said to show you page 4. I opened the cracked leather cover, turned to the 4th page with the jagged red handwriting, and pushed the journal across the desk toward him. Thomas leaned down under the warm circle of the desk lamp. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his apron pocket, rested them on the bridge of his nose, and began to read. As his eyes moved across Eleanor's hurried, frantic writing, I watched his face. The color drained out of his weathered skin. His jaw set so hard that a vein began to throb along his scarred cheek. When he reached the bottom of the page, where Eleanor had written, "They did not let me die of natural causes," his hands began to tremble. He slowly pulled off his glasses. He picked up the journal, holding page 4 up directly under the harsh glare of the lamp, inspecting the tiny series of numbers written beneath her signature. "My God," Thomas whispered. "She found the second ledger." "What is that box, Thomas?" I demanded, my patience snapping under the agony of mystery. What did my wife involve herself in? "Who are they?" Thomas looked up at me, his eyes sharp as flint. He didn't answer my question. Instead, he reached into his apron pocket, pulled out a small, specialized steel tool with 6 delicate prongs, and inserted it into the brass cylinder of the iron box. He didn't pick the lock. He operated it like someone who had built it himself. Click, click, clack. The heavy lid of the iron box popped open by half an inch with a sharp metallic gasp of trapped air. Thomas didn't open it fully. He pushed the box 3 inches closer to me. "Look inside, Arthur," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a harsh, cold whisper. Look at what your wife was protecting you from for 34 years. I reached out with a trembling hand, lifted the heavy iron lid, and looked into the dark interior. Sitting on top of a stack of faded yellow legal documents was a black leather binder. Tucked inside the front cover were 3 official medical lab reports from St. Jude's Hospital, dated just 10 days before Eleanor died. And right beneath the medical reports was a printed bank transfer receipt for $2.4 million, transferred from an offshore trust directly into a private investment account held under a name I knew better than my own. Julian Vance. My heart slammed against my ribs, so hard I thought it would crack. My vision went blurry around the edges. Julian! I choked out, staring at my son's signature on the bottom of the transfer document. What is this money? Why does Julian have this? Thomas leaned across the desk, placing his heavy, grease-stained hands flat on the oak table. He looked me dead in the eye, his voice slicing through the cold room like a steel blade. That money was the final payment for Eleanor's silence, Arthur, Thomas said slowly. And those lab reports, they aren't cancer records. They are chemical toxicology scans. Eleanor wasn't sick. She was being systematically poisoned with synthetic heavy metals over 4 months. The room seemed to tilt beneath my feet. No, that's impossible. The doctor said. The doctors were paid off by Crestview Medical, a subsidiary owned by Julian's private equity firm. Thomas interrupted ruthlessly. He reached over, grabbed the journal, and slammed his thumb onto page 4. Read the numbers again, Arthur. Look at the routing codes. Thomas shouted grimly. 30 years ago, before Eleanor met you, she worked as a chief auditor for Crestview. She discovered they were laundering billions through illegal land acquisitions and toxic waste dump sites in rural counties. When she tried to blow the whistle, they tried to eliminate her. I helped her disappear. I built that box. I gave her a new identity, and she found you, a quiet history teacher who gave her a safe, beautiful life. Thomas leaned in closer, his scarred face inches from mine. She kept quiet to keep you alive, Thomas whispered. But 4 months ago, Julian discovered who his mother really was. He found out she still held the master decryption keys to Crestview's illegal billions. He didn't see a mother, Arthur. He saw a $50 million liability that stood between him and his promotion to senior managing partner. I stood there, frozen in terror, holding the paper with my son's name on it. Thomas took a slow step back, picked up his desk phone, and dialed a 3-digit number. He listened to the dial tone for 2 seconds, then looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated coldness. Call the FBI, Arthur, Thomas said softly. Because your son isn't just a traitor. He's a murderer. The world didn't stop, even though mine had just shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. I stood in the dim, oily backroom of Miller's Lock and Key, staring at the white piece of paper in my hand. The name Julian Vance burned into my retinas like a brand. My son, the baby boy I had held in the delivery room 32 years ago, whose tiny fingers had wrapped around my thumb while the autumn rain tapped against the hospital glass. The boy I had taught to read, to ride a bicycle down Oak Street, to be an honest man. He had looked into his mother's dying eyes, held her pale, trembling hand, and watched the life drain out of her day by day, knowing he was the one pouring the poison into her cup. Arthur, Thomas's voice cut through the roaring silence in my head. He was holding the old black landline receiver out toward me. Take the phone. Special Agent Miller at the regional field office in Pittsburgh is an old friend. He knows about Crestview. He knows what Eleanor was holding. I looked at the phone, then down at the iron box. My mind was a chaotic storm of shock, grief, and a dark, terrifying clarity. If I handed this over to the FBI right now, it would become a federal case. There would be investigations, press leaks, corporate lawyers, sealed indictments, and years of legal maneuvering. Julian's firm had billions of dollars behind them. They had former senators on their advisory boards, top-tier defense attorneys in Washington, and endless resources to stall, bury evidence, or buy off witnesses. Julian would hire a high-priced legal team. He would claim he was framed, that the money was an offshore consulting bonus, that his mother was delusional in her final days. He might spend a few years in a comfortable federal institution, or worse, walk away on a technicality while the corporation wiped its hands clean. Justice in a courtroom was slow, sanitized, and often sold to the highest bidder. No, I said softly, my voice surprisingly steady. Thomas frowned, lowering the phone slightly. What do you mean, no? Arthur, this isn't a high school history lesson. These people are ruthless. They killed your wife. And if we give this to the FBI tonight, I said, stepping closer to the desk, Julian's firm will know within 2 hours. They have eyes in the federal building, Thomas. You know they do. The moment an inquiry is logged, the secondary paper trails will disappear, the lab techs at St. Jude's will vanish, and Julian will slip out of the country on a private jet to a non-extradition territory. Thomas stared at me, his gray eyes narrowing as he slowly set the receiver back onto its cradle. The mechanical clack echoed through the room. What are you thinking, Arthur? Thomas asked, his tone cautious. I spent 34 years teaching kids about history, I said, looking down at the ledger numbers written in Eleanor's frantic script. And if history teaches us anything, it's that empires don't fall because of external enemies. They fall from the inside. When the people at the top get arrogant, they leave doors unlocked. They assume everyone beneath them is too weak, too old, or too stupid to notice. I lifted my eyes to meet Thomas's. Julian thinks I'm a broken, grieving old man living off a teacher's pension. He thinks I'm waiting to die in that empty house. He expects me to sign over the property deed next week, so he can complete his investment merger. A slow, cold smile flickered across Thomas's scarred face, the first shadow of approval I had seen on his face all night. You want to use the deed as bait, Thomas murmured. I want to take everything from him, I said, every word dropping like a lead weight. Not just his freedom. I want to strip away his money, his reputation, his arrogance, and the precious firm he traded his mother's life for. I want him to watch his world burn down around him, piece by piece, until he has nothing left except the wall of a concrete cell. Thomas stood silently for a long moment. Then he reached over to his desk, grabbed the glass of whiskey he had poured earlier, and handed it to me. Eleanor always said you were a gentle man, Arthur, Thomas said quietly. She said you wouldn't hurt a fly, but she also said that if anyone ever threatened the people you loved, there wouldn't be a force on earth that could stop you. I took the glass, but I didn't drink. I set it down beside the open iron box. Tell me everything, Thomas, I said. Tell me how Crestview operates. Tell me how Eleanor kept them at bay for 30 years. And tell me how we turned this key into a blade. Thomas pulled a heavy steel stool up to the workbench and gestured for me to sit. He reached into the iron box, pulled out the thick black binder, and spread the blueprints and financial ledgers across the table under the yellow desk light. Crestview isn't just a private equity group, Thomas explained, pointing his thick finger at a flow chart of shell companies. It's a syndicate. 30 years ago, they bought up thousands of acres of cheap land across Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. They told the local towns they were building logistics hubs and clean energy plants. In reality, they were burying industrial chemical waste from illegal manufacturing plants deep under the topsoil. He flipped the page to a list of corporate officers. Eleanor was their lead auditor in 1991. Thomas continued. She uncovered a secondary set of books, the Black Ledger. It documented every bribe paid to state inspectors, every illegal transfer, and every shell company used to funnel the profits into offshore trusts in the Cayman Islands. When she realized what they were doing, she stole the master drive and the physical ledgers. They hunted her for 6 months. I helped her forge a new identity, Eleanor Vance, and clear her digital footprint. Why didn't she destroy the ledger? I asked, my heart aching for the terrifying life my wife had lived before she found me. Because the ledger was her insurance policy, Thomas answered grimly. As long as she held the master decryption keys, Crestview couldn't move the $400 million sitting in those offshore accounts without triggering an automatic flag to the Treasury Department. It was a Cold War, Arthur. They couldn't touch her without risking total exposure. And she couldn't expose them without putting a target on your back. Until Julian, I whispered. Until Julian. Thomas agreed heavily. Julian became a partner at Crestview's parent firm 2 years ago. He's ambitious, reckless, and deeply in debt from bad investments in foreign tech stock. He started digging into the old company vaults, trying to find a way to release those frozen billions to save himself from bankruptcy. That's when he found his mother's original employee file. He realized the woman who raised him was the only person standing between him and $400 million. I closed my eyes as a wave of nausea washed over me. Julian hadn't just committed a crime. He had sold his mother's life to cover his own financial failures. How does the trust work? I asked, opening my eyes and looking at the legal documents in the binder. The iron box contains the master encryption key on a cold storage hardware drive, Thomas said, pointing to a small, heavy silver USB device tucked into a leather sleeve in the back of the binder. It requires 3 things to access the offshore accounts: the drive itself, Eleanor's original biometric digital signature, and the execution of the property deed to your family ranch. I frowned. Our house. Why our house? Because your 500-acre property isn't just a farm, Arthur, Thomas revealed, his eyes locking onto mine with chilling intensity. It sits directly above Crestview's largest illegal waste site from 1989. As long as you own that land, no one can dig, build, or audit the soil. But if Julian gets you to sign that property deed over to his trust, Crestview can classify the land as a private corporate sanctuary, permanently burying the evidence and releasing the frozen funds. Everything fell into place. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with violent precision. Julian's sudden visits during Eleanor's illness, his insistence that I be pragmatic, his repeated requests for me to sign the property transfer papers under the guise of estate planning. He didn't care about my pension or my comfort. He needed my signature to complete the transaction and claim his payout. I stood up from the stool. The grief that had weighed me down for 42 days was gone, burned away by a cold, sharp, unyielding rage. Julian called me yesterday, I said quietly, looking down at my watch. He said he's coming to the house on Friday at 4 o'clock. He's bringing his corporate lawyers and the final property transfer documents. He wants me to sign. Thomas looked up at me, his hand resting on the iron box. What are you going to do, Arthur? I'm going to invite him in, I said softly. I'm going to offer him tea, and then I'm going to give him exactly what he deserves. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of meticulous preparation. I didn't sleep. The exhaustion that had dragged behind me like a heavy chain since Eleanor's funeral was gone, replaced by a strange, humming energy. When a man loses everything he loves, fear simply ceases to exist. There was nothing left for them to take from me. On Wednesday morning, Thomas arrived at my house in his faded blue pickup truck. He brought a battered leather satchel filled with specialized equipment, not weapons, but tools of digital warfare. While I brewed a pot of black coffee in the kitchen, Thomas went to work in the living room. With the quiet precision of a surgeon, he installed 3 microscopic pinhole cameras into the dark wooden frame of the mantelpiece above the fireplace. He ran paper-thin, shielded wiring behind the wallpaper, connecting the feeds to an encrypted digital recording deck hidden inside the old grandfather clock in the hallway. This system records directly to a cloud server hosted in Switzerland, Thomas explained, wiping his grease-stained hands on his jeans as he stepped back to test the lens angle. The moment Julian steps into this room, every word he utters, every document he places on that table, and every expression on his face will be broadcast live to a secure server. If he tries to wipe local drives or destroy paper trails, it won't matter. The record will be permanent. What about the offshore account? I asked, sitting down at the kitchen table with the black binder open before me. That's the masterstroke, Thomas said, a dark glint in his eye. I re-encoded Eleanor's silver hardware drive. When Julian connects that drive to his firm's private portal to release the $400 million, it won't just unlock the funds. It will execute an automated script that broadcasts Crestview's entire double-entry ledger to the Department of Justice, the Internal Revenue Service, and every major financial news outlet in North America simultaneously. I looked out the window at the gray, rain-soaked pastures stretching toward the treeline. He won't be able to resist. Greed makes men stupid, Arthur, Thomas replied softly. He thinks he's playing chess against an old history teacher. He doesn't realize he's walking into a room where the floorboards have already been removed. Friday afternoon arrived with a cold, biting wind that rattled the loose panes in the sunroom. At exactly 3 minutes to 4, the sharp crunch of gravel announced the arrival of a vehicle in the driveway. I stood by the front window, holding a hot ceramic mug of tea, and watched as a sleek black luxury sedan pulled up to the porch. The driver's door opened, and Julian stepped out. He was wearing a charcoal gray tailored wool coat, a crisp white shirt, and polished black leather shoes that looked entirely out of place on the muddy driveway. Behind him stepped out a second man, tall, mid-40s, wearing a sharp navy suit and carrying a heavy leather briefcase. That was Marcus Vance, no relation, though he shared our last name, Crestvew's chief legal counsel and Julian's primary accomplice. I watched my son button his coat, adjust a silk tie in the side mirror of his car, and check his gold wristwatch. There was no sadness in his posture, no hesitation in his stride. He looked like a land developer inspecting a lot he was eager to tear down. The heavy brass knocker on the front door sounded 3 times. Thud, thud, thud. I took a slow breath, set my mug on the kitchen counter, and walked down the hallway. I paused by the grandfather clock, listening to the steady tick-tock of the pendulum, before pulling open the heavy oak door. "Dad," Julian said, offering a tight, practiced smile that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. "You look tired." "Hello, Julian," I said, my voice deliberately soft, frail, and hollow, the voice of a broken old man beaten down by grief. I stepped back, holding the door open. "Coming out of the cold." Julian brushed past me into the entryway, bringing with him the smell of expensive cologne and damp leather. Marcus followed close behind, his sharp eyes flicking around the hallway with cool, calculating assessment. "Dad, this is Marcus," Julian said casually, taking off his coat and hanging it on the wooden rack. "He's the senior managing partner overseeing the estate transition. I asked him to come along to make sure all the paperwork is handled seamlessly today." "Mr. Vance," Marcus said, extending a cold, dry hand. "My condolences on your loss. Eleanor was a remarkable woman." Hearing my wife's name cross the lips of the man who helped arrange her murder made my stomach turn, but I forced a weak, trembling nod and shook his hand. "Thank you," I murmured, looking down at the floorboards. She loved this house. It's hard being here without her." "I know. Dad, I know." Julian cut in, placing a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder as he steered me toward the living room. "That's exactly why we need to get this sorted out. Leaving you here alone in this drafty old place, worrying about property taxes and maintenance, it's not what Mom would have wanted. It's time for you to let go." We sat down around the heavy oak coffee table in front of the fireplace. The fire crackled softly, casting long, dancing shadows across the rug. Marcus set his leather briefcase flat on the table, popped the dual brass combination locks with a sharp click, and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents stamped with red corporate seals. "Arthur," Marcus began, his voice smooth as oil. "These are the final transfer deeds for the Oak Ridge property, along with the release forms for Eleanor's personal estate holdings. Once you sign these, Crestview's private foundation will assume all outstanding liabilities, taxes, and maintenance fees on the ranch. In return, the foundation will deposit a guaranteed monthly stipend of $8,000 directly into your personal account for the rest of your life." He pushed a heavy gold fountain pen across the table toward me. I looked at the pen, then at the thick stack of papers. I let my hand tremble slightly as I reached out, touching the cold metal of the pen without picking it up. $8,000 a month, I whispered, keeping my head bowed. That's a lot of money for an old teacher, Julian." "You earned it, Dad," Julian said quickly, leaning forward, his eyes shining with an eager, hungry intensity he couldn't quite hide. "You spent 40 years working yourself to the bone. Now you can move into that quiet retirement community in Florida I showed you last month. You won't have to lift a finger." "And the land?" I asked, looking up directly into my son's eyes. "What happens to the 500 acres? What happens to the cabin by the creek?" Julian waved his hand dismissively. "It will be preserved under a private corporate conservatorship, Dad. Nothing changes. The trees stay. The land stays." "Liar," I thought to myself. "You're going to cap the toxic waste, pave over her memory, and pocket $40 million. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands over my knee. "Julian," I said softly, changing the subject with deliberate slowness. "Before I sign anything, I found something in your mother's closet 3 days ago." Julian's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. The eager smile faded from his lips. "What do you mean? What did you find?" "An old iron box," I said, "and a navy blue journal." The silence that fell over the room was instant and total. Across the table, Marcus's hand froze midair as he reached into his pocket for a handkerchief. Julian's eyes narrowed into two razor-thin slits, all traces of filial warmth vanishing in a single heartbeat. "An iron box," Julian repeated, his voice dropping an octave, losing every trace of its soft, sympathetic tone. "Where is it, Dad?" "It was under the floorboards in her sewing room," I said quietly, looking directly into his cold, calculating eyes. It had a brass lock on the side, and inside there was a black binder filled with numbers, bank codes, and medical records from St. Jude's. Marcus leaned forward, his smooth voice suddenly turning sharp and dangerous. "Arthur, where is that box right now?" I didn't answer Marcus. I kept my gaze locked onto my son, the boy I raised, the man who had sold his mother's breath for a ledger entry. "Why were there toxicology reports in your mother's box, Julian?" I asked softly, every word echoing in the quiet room. "And why was your signature on a $2 million transfer receipt dated 10 days before she died?" Julian didn't flinch. He didn't deny it. He didn't cry out in innocence. Instead, a slow, dark, terrifying expression settled over his face. The mask of the grieving, dutiful son slipped away entirely, revealing the cold, sociopathic corporate shark underneath. He slowly leaned back in his leather chair, crossed his legs, and looked at me not as a father, but as an inconvenient obstacle that needed to be managed. "You should have just signed the papers, Dad," Julian said coldly. "You really should have just signed the papers." The air in the living room turned instantly oppressive, thick with the unsaid truth hanging between us. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting long, harsh shadows against the walls. "You don't understand how the real world works, Dad," Julian said, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth or remorse. "You spent your whole life in a classroom teaching children about dead kings and ancient battles. You think the world operates on honor and rules. It doesn't. It operates on leverage." Marcus placed a hand on Julian's arm, cautioning him. "Julian, keep it contained." "No, Marcus," Julian snapped, waving him off without taking his eyes off me. "He brought it up. He wants answers. I'll give him answers. Look around you, Dad. Look at this decaying house, this drafty old farm. Mother spent 30 years hiding in the shadows because she was terrified of a past she couldn't outrun. She held onto those decryption keys like a child holding a security blanket, letting millions sit dormant while we lived off a high school teacher's salary. She was protecting us, Julian," I said, my voice steady, though my heart pounded against my ribs like a sledgehammer. "She was protecting you." Julian let out a short, bitter laugh. "Protecting me? She was holding me back. Do you have any idea what kind of opportunity Crestview presented? I was on the verge of becoming a principal partner, Dad, a multi-million-dollar equity stake. All I needed was her authorization to release the frozen trust accounts. But she refused. Every single time I asked, every time I begged her to be reasonable, she gave me that same look of self-righteous pity." He leaned forward, placing his elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on mine with terrifying intensity. "She was going to take those keys to her grave, Dad. She was going to let everything I worked for fall apart just to satisfy her pathetic moral crusade. I couldn't let her ruin my future. I did what had to be done to secure what was rightfully ours. By poisoning her, I whispered, forcing the words out through a tight throat. By buying off doctors and watching her slowly fade away." Marcus stood up abruptly, pulling a leather binder from his briefcase. "That's enough. Mr. Vance, let's be entirely clear about your position here. You have no leverage. The medical reports you found are uncertified copies. The financial transfers are routed through third-party offshore entities that cannot be legally tied to Julian in any domestic court. If you take this to the authorities, we will tie you up in legal motions until your pension runs out, and you will spend the rest of your life bankrupt and disgraced." Marcus slid the transfer deed back across the table, resting the gold pen directly on top of the signature line. "Sign the deed, Arthur," Marcus said, his tone turning cold and transactional. "You transfer the ranch to Crestview's foundation today, you get your monthly stipend, and you walk away. Refuse, and we will file an emergency power of attorney petition claiming your mental state has deteriorated since your wife's passing. Either way, Crestview takes the land. The only question is whether you walk away with money or with nothing." I looked down at the paper. The white sheet seemed to glow under the lamplight, a symbol of everything my son had traded his soul for. I picked up the pen. Julian's eyes flared with victory. He leaned back, a smug, satisfied smirk creeping onto his face as he watched me uncork the gold cap. "Smart man, Dad," Julian murmured. "I knew you'd see reason." I looked at him, really looked at him. The tiny silver cufflinks on his sleeves, the cold precision of his haircut, the absolute absence of a conscience. I felt no anger anymore, only a profound, freezing clarity. I placed the tip of the pen on the paper, and then, with a single, sharp motion, I pressed down hard and pulled the pen straight across the document, ripping the thick paper completely in half. Tear! The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. Julian jumped out of his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "What the hell are you doing?" I slowly stacked the torn pieces of paper, folded them neatly in half, and dropped them into the burning fireplace. The paper caught fire instantly, curling into black, ash-filled flakes in the flames. "I gave you every chance, Julian," I said softly, standing up from my chair to face him. "I gave you the chance to come in here today, look me in the eye, and show a single shred of remorse. I wanted to see if there was any piece of the boy I raised left inside you." "You old fool," Julian spat, his face flushing red with rage. "You just signed your own warrant. We're seizing this property by Monday morning." "You won't make it to Monday, Julian," I replied smoothly. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small black remote control, and pressed the center button. From the hallway, the loud mechanical chime of the grandfather clock sounded once, followed by a low, high-pitched tone as the hidden recording deck transmitted its final encrypted data package. "What was that?" Marcus asked, his head snapping toward the door, his lawyer's instincts immediately sensing danger. "That," I said, pointing up toward the mantelpiece where the microscopic camera lens reflected the firelight, was a live, uncompressed audio and video stream of the last 15 minutes. Broadcast directly to Special Agent Miller at the FBI Regional Field Office in Pittsburgh, as well as the U.S. Attorney's Financial Crimes Division. Julian's face drained of color so fast it looked as though he had been struck. You're lying. Check your phone, Julian," I said calmly. As if on cue, both Julian's and Marcus's smartphones began to vibrate violently on the table. Screen after screen lit up with urgent notifications, incoming calls from corporate headquarters, emergency text alerts, and breaking news banners. Marcus snatched his phone off the table, his eyes darting frantically across the screen. "Oh God! Marcus, look at the wire reports." Julian pulled out his phone with trembling hands. The headline flashing across the financial news network read, "Crestview financial assets frozen amid federal RICO indictment. Master decipherment keys released online." "The iron box wasn't just holding medical reports, Julian," I said, stepping closer to them, my shadow falling long over the table. "Thomas re-encoded your mother's drive. The moment I pressed that remote, her master keys executed an automated script. Every offshore account, every bribe ledger, every toxic wasteland deal Crestview conducted over the last 30 years has just been published on a public federal server." Marcus dropped his briefcase, his face pale as chalk. "The entire firm, it's gone. The Treasury just locked the clearing accounts." Julian stared at his phone, his thumb flicking frantically across the glass, trying in vain to access his personal investment accounts. "My funds," Julian whispered, his voice cracking into a high, panicked pitch. "My $2.4 million, it's wiped. The account is suspended." "It isn't just suspended, Julian," I told him, looking him dead in the eye. "It's seized as evidence in a capital murder investigation." Outside, the heavy wail of sirens cut through the quiet rain, echoing up the long, winding road toward the ranch. Julian dropped his phone. The glass screen shattered against the oak floorboards, the display flickering twice before going completely dark, just like his future. "Dad, please!" Julian stumbled backward, his hands shaking violently as he looked from the window back to me. All his arrogance, his cold corporate polish, and his calculated malice evaporated in an instant. He looked like a terrified child caught in a lie he couldn't talk his way out of. "Dad, talk to them. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them you made a mistake. I'm your son. Your only son. My son died 4 months ago," I said, my voice dropping to a low, quiet whisper that cut deeper than any scream. He died the day he decided his mother's life had a price tag. Marcus didn't say a word. He didn't even look at Julian. The seasoned corporate attorney simply stepped away, pulled off a silk tie, threw it onto the table, and sank into the corner armchair with his head buried in his hands, waiting for the inevitable. The front door burst open with a heavy bang. Heavy tactical boots echoed down the hallway, and within seconds, 6 armed federal agents stepped into the living room, led by Special Agent Miller, a tall, stern man with graying hair and an FBI badge pinned to his belt. Julian Vance. Marcus Vance. Agent Miller shouted, his voice filling the room with undeniable authority. Hands where we can see them. Do not move. Julian didn't fight. He didn't run. As 2 agents forced his arms behind his back and snapped the cold steel handcuffs around his wrists, he stared at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. Dad! Please! Don't let them do this! He sobbed, his voice cracking with pathetic desperation. I'll give the money back. I'll fix it. Please, Dad! I stood silently by the fireplace, watching as they led him toward the door. As he crossed the threshold, I looked him in the eye one last time. You thought power came from money, Julian, I said quietly. You forgot that truth always outlasts the lie. 2 weeks later, the rain finally stopped. The afternoon sun broke through the gray clouds, casting a warm, golden light over the rolling hills of the ranch. The air smelled of fresh pine, damp earth, and clean spring breeze. I stood on the small wooden porch behind my cabin, holding a warm cup of tea. Beside me sat the iron box, now open, emptied of its dark secrets, its heavy iron lid resting peacefully under the sunlight. Crestview Financial had completely collapsed. The federal indictments led to the arrest of 14 senior executives, the freezing of over $400 million in illicit assets, and the cleanup of toxic waste sites across 3 states. Julian faced federal charges of conspiracy, grand fraud, and first-degree murder, a trial where the state prosecutor assured me he would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars without the possibility of parole. Thomas walked up the porch steps, carrying a small wooden tool chest. He set it down, looked out over the sunlit pastures, and breathed in the crisp mountain air. It's quiet again, Arthur, Thomas said softly. Yes, I replied, looking toward the hill where Eleanor rested under the oak tree. It's finally quiet. Revenge didn't bring Eleanor back. It didn't heal the scar on my heart or fill the silence in our bedroom. But as I looked at the land she had died to protect, land that was now permanently secured as a nature reserve in her name, I felt a deep, profound sense of peace. Greed promises the world, but in the end, it leaves you with nothing. Integrity may walk a slow and humble road, but it is the only road that leads home.